when some of the bargaining parties are relatively high income and other bargaining parties are relatively low income. And one of the reasons for that is the costs, as we talked about with the environmental Kuznets curve last time, some of the costs associated with these global problems will fall more heavily on the lower income countries. They're already not using some of the cleaner technologies that are available. And so unless there's some way of also addressing cost sharing, it's unlikely that the poorer countries of the world are actually going to agree to some of these more substantive changes. So one of the things that we might ask ourselves is, how do we make decisions as individual countries? Now remember, when we're really talking about global pollution or global environmental problems, it's often the case that most of the external costs are imposed on people outside your country, so that the production process might take place within the country, but a lot of the costs are actually imposed on others, which of course is why they're complaining and want you to enter into an agreement to stop polluting the environment so much. So we can also think about this as an environmental game. We've seen this before. But in this case, let's just take two imaginary countries. I don't mean to pick on anybody here. Let's just call them the US and China. And we have a choice of either regulating our production activity or not regulating our production activity. And so what we want to think about is where the benefits and where the costs are when we do one of these types of activities, and what difference it makes whether we're doing something that the other country is also doing, or whether or not it's very different. We also want to think here about both producers, that is the people who are engaged in the manufacturing process or whatever the process is that's causing the pollution, and consumers. And here we want to think about consumers with a little c and very broadly. And here what we mean by consumers are consumers of the external costs. That is, who is actually consuming the pollution, rather than the good and services that are actually being produced. So we want to know who benefits and who loses from these kinds of issues. So we're going to assume that these two countries are symmetrical because it makes it somewhat easier to look at this. So let's look at the upper left-hand quadrant for a moment, where both countries are regulating. Right? So here, in the upper left-hand corner, if we regulate, that regulation actually costs companies something to do. Right? It increases their business costs. They've got to clean up the pollution that they're causing. So for U.S. producers, there's a negative. Right? So for U.S. producers, there's clearly a negative. For U.S. consumers, I'm just going to say, CON. There's a positive. There's also a positive for Chinese consumers. So if U.S. firms are polluting less because they're regulated, the U.S. consumers, that is, who are buying in some sense, not paying for, but being imposed upon the pollution, are going to get a benefit. They've got cleaner air to breathe, for example. But since most of the pollution is global, it's going outside the country to China, Chinese consumers will also benefit from that. Well, if China regulates, yes? Yes, we haven't filled in China yet. This is just a U.S. regulation. Yes. Okay. So if China also regulates, then China producers, we call it China pros, will also lose because they'll have to bear that cost. Chinese consumers will get a benefit, and U.S. consumers will get a bigger benefit if most of the pollution is global. So notice this looks like if you favored consumer welfare over producer welfare, this is clearly where you would want to be. Now, let's think about filling in this upper right-hand quadrant. So let's think about it from the U.S. perspective. China is going to regulate, but the U.S. is not going to regulate. So what we should see is U.S. producers gain. Right? They don't have to bear the cost of controlling their pollution because they're not regulated. U.S. consumers lose, but because most of the pollution is global going outside of the country, China's consumers lose too, and maybe even lose more. Because it's global pollution. Most of the pollution is going outside of our local country. Okay, so we could now, since we're assuming symmetry, we can tell that this lower left-hand triangle is going to be exactly the same except for China's producers. So down here, China's producers gain, China's consumers lose, and U.S. consumers lose. In fact, we could put 2 there, right? Because they lose twice. They lose more than the domestic consumers. Okay, so now let's think about what happens, in China, they're regulating. So here, China producers lose. China consumers lose. Now notice the reason that they're losing is the U.S. See, by regulating here, China's consumers are better off. But since there's more pollution coming in from the United States, and the global pollution is greater than the local pollution, China's consumers will lose. And U.S. consumers lose. Is that right? U.S. it shouldn't be lose anyway. U.S. consumers, let's see. We don't, they do. Oh yeah, U.S. consumers lose because we're not regulated. Although this last one is fairly small because the regulation in China produces a positive for U.S. consumers, it's the non-regulation abroad. So actually that's probably a small positive. And then again, we could fill in down here. Okay, Okay, so now all we have to think about is what's in this lower right-hand quadrant where neither country regulates. So we know when you don't regulate, producers are better off. They do not have to bear the cost, and that's true in both countries. But if the U.S. producers are not regulated, then U.S. consumers lose. If China is not regulating their producers, U.S. consumers lose from the global pollution. China's consumers are also worse off from the U.S. not regulating. And so down here in this lower right-hand quadrant, we end up with consumers losing across the board with respect to producers. So if we look at all the gains and losses and we thought about where we would end up, one of the things that we would see, if all pollution were local, so we didn't have to worry about the effects on other countries, the cost to consumers would be about the same as the cost to producers. And then what we need to think about is how do we, as a government or as a society, feel about how those costs, those gains and costs are actually allocated. So when we look in the United States, we actually have a number of government organizations like the Environmental Protection Agency, which looks at a lot of local sources of pollution and what the benefit to that industry is versus the cost that it imposes on domestic consumers. So we can make a kind of a national cost-benefit analysis. So if we weight more towards consumers than we do producers, we're going to end up in the upper left-hand quadrant with local pollution. So the upper left-hand quadrant turns out to be the Nash equilibrium when we have local pollution. But if we've got global pollution, so that your production activity imposes some small cost on your domestic consumers, but much larger cost on foreign consumers, that is, we're down in this lower right-hand quadrant, you should be able to see that the outcome here is that we're going to be in the lower right-hand quadrant. This turns out to be the Nash equilibrium when we have global pollution. It's in every country's own best interest not to regulate, in part because most of the cost of the pollution is being incurred by people outside the country. So in that case, you want to get the gain from your domestic production, your domestic cost associated with that will be much smaller. So this lower right-hand quadrant then becomes the Nash equilibrium when we have global pollution environment. Notice that that's a much worse situation than actually being up here. The old prisoner dilemma. We saw this before with trade wars. We saw this with one of the strategic trade examples, that you can actually end up being much worse off, but it turns out to be the best decision for each country to undertake. So what we see here is that the best global policy, each country tightens its standards, but it works only if each country does this. If any country, significant country, drops out, then of course it's not going to work. So if you think about this aspect, as well as thinking about the cost that's imposed on this, it's pretty easy, I think, to understand the disagreements between the developed world and the rapidly developing world, in particular China, Brazil, and India, about global warming and how big a problem it is and who should pay for it. Should we have regressive costs, that is, poor countries would pay a much higher proportion to bring their production standards up, or should there be some sort of subsidy from the developed world in order to help bring down global pollutants? Now, even if we can decide to regulate, we still have a lot of problems that need to be worked out. One is, what exactly is the cost to the environmental damage? So if you think about the Gulf oil spill that took place this past summer, the original estimates were we won't be able to eat fish out of the Gulf of Mexico for the next 100 years, right? And this weekend they're having 240 some odd chefs from around the country going to New Orleans serving nothing but seafood. I'm not going to eat it, but they're at least cooking it up and serving it. The FDA says, yeah, it's all clean. And now when we look at the total cost of the environmental damage, it appears to be, at least what we know or what the scientists know now, seems to be dramatically less than what we thought 6 months ago. So that's part of the problem that's involved with environmental damage is how much of a self-healing environment is the Earth itself. You get different ideas about that. Now, another issue, of course, is what's the cost actually associated with doing some of these things? Right now, for instance, we know that one of the big problems in terms of global warming or global air pollution is the burning of soft coal to generate electricity. When you burn soft coal, you put sulfur into the air. When it hits water particles, that sulfur in the air turns into something that looks like sulfur dioxide, which turns out to be really close to an acid. So you can have all sorts of problems there. Now, what's the cost of actually fixing that? How far do you have to go to fix it? Do you need to go halfway, take half the sulfur out? Is that good enough? Do you need to take 90% out? So you've always got this trade-off that's going on in terms of how much damage is actually being done and what are the costs actually associated with it. And finally, especially for relatively small countries, one of the things that we know is that some of them will be unwilling to participate in any sort of multilateral agreement. They'll be unwilling to participate in part because they see themselves at the margin as not contributing very much to the problem, and therefore they don't think they should have to contribute very much at all to the solution. They, of course, would benefit from larger countries, and here when we mean small and large, we actually mean the amount of pollution that's taking place. They would still benefit from reduction in pollution by large countries. This, of course, is what is generally known as a free rider problem, and if you have a significant number of those small countries doing the free riding, then it becomes incredibly difficult to actually achieve the goals that you're looking at. So again, global multilateral agreements are what are necessary, but as we've seen time and time again, they are often very, very difficult, if not impossible, to get anything done. Most of the global environmental agreements that have been successful have been very narrowly focused where the costs are also very, very low. Oh, we did that, didn't we? Oh, okay. So just a couple of things here to finish up. One, I would encourage you to check your grades on BSpace and make sure that they're right relative to what you've got on your papers. Any discrepancies, anything that's missing, make sure you notify your GSI. They can take care of it. If it's something that you either don't have the paper back from, problem set 6, or there's some other, you can't find your paper, then right now, then you should try and find that. You can bring it to the final exam and we can get it fixed there. As you know, our final exam is Friday, the 17th of December. E-grades are supposed to be in on the 23rd. When they told me that, I laughed. May happen, not likely, but it may happen. The only thing that I can tell you is after all of the GSIs have finished grading, not just yours, but all 4 of them have to be completely finished grading, it takes me somewhere between 24 and 48 hours to determine course grades. I actually try to do that very, very carefully to minimize errors and corrections that we need to make later. I will take my time doing that. I'm not going to rush it. I'm not going to rush the GSIs for grading either. So while we hope to have everything done before Christmas, I'm not saying you have to look, but while we hope to, there are no guarantees, and it may not be until after Christmas before final grades are up. Once they are up, I will post them to BSpace and to Bearfax, and we'll send out an email. So if you're a masochist, you can look right away, and if you want to enjoy your vacation, you can wait for days or weeks or hours or decades or whatever it might be. Okay, let's do a real quick summary. So what have we seen here? So we talked about 6 valuable lessons that we can take away from international trade. I know it seems odd, right? 15 weeks and we only have 6 lessons. But the first lesson, which is clearly the most important, is free trade, or a movement towards trade liberalization, has a tendency to raise aggregate economic efficiency and aggregate economic welfare. So if you think back to our Ricardian models, our standard trade models, all of those models basically showed that the total level of output in the world can be increased by rearranging production along international lines, primarily along the lines of comparative advantage, but also taking advantage of economies of scale. So that's our first lesson that we've learned here. The second thing that we learned is that, especially in the Heckscher-Ohlin and standard trade model, some people will lose from international trade. And we need to actually be very clear about that. There has been a tendency, because of lesson number 1, to think that all countries are always better all the time when we have more international trade. And then we know that that is simply not the case. We saw with the standard trade, with the specific factors models, that there are losers in the short run, and we saw with the Heckscher-Ohlin model that there are losers in the long run. We also know from things that we've discussed that the losses are generally heavily concentrated, while the benefits are generally widely diffused. And that, of course, leads to different political outcomes and different policy choices. We also saw, from a comparative advantage perspective, that free trade can help any country, even if it is inefficient in every industry. It is not absolute advantage, but rather comparative advantage that makes a difference, and every country has a comparative advantage in something. Now, the downside is actually figuring out what that comparative advantage is, and having entrepreneurs or government bureaucrats who are so enlightened that they can actually take advantage of that comparative advantage. We also know that a company that may be the most efficient in the world can actually lose in the context of international trade. So we could see that in economies of scale, but that's also true in terms of comparative advantage. The most efficient company in the world has an absolute advantage, but not necessarily a comparative advantage. It's still comparative advantage, not just for countries, but also for industries and for companies within industries. Trade protection can be beneficial for a country. Can doesn't mean it will be. So we also need to recognize this, that some countries with certain trade policies can actually benefit by having a movement away from free trade towards more protectionism. That, of course, requires an optimal tariff, which is only consistent with a large economy. But it is possible to actually extract that gain. But when you do so, you've done so. When you do so, you've done that by exercising essentially your monopoly power, your ability to influence the world price. So the gain that you can get from trade protection actually comes at the expense of your trading partners. And then finally, it must be finally because it says 6, and it says 6 at the top, the case for free trade remains really strong, in part because the ability to impose an optimal tariff or to have the right government policy for something like a strategic trade policy is a very narrow set of cases. It's not going to apply to the vast majority of countries in the world, and it's not going to apply to the vast majority of industries in which international trade takes place. So even though some trade protection can be possible, it's not likely to be the case that any broad movement towards trade protection will be beneficial. There should be a 7th lesson, and that is trade policy is made on the basis of politics, not economics. And so it's the political environment that generally gives us a movement towards trade protection. One of the things that I think is most amazing about the post-World War II trend towards trade liberalization, not just in the developed countries, but also in the developing countries, is that the political bias is actually to trade protection. The losers from international trade are highly concentrated and much more motivated to protect their own interests, much more so than the beneficiaries of free trade, where the benefits are widely diffused, and so the individual gains are very, very small. So even given that, we've seen a massive move towards trade liberalization over the last 50 or 60 years, and this has meant that world economic activity has become more efficient, world GDP has grown faster, and we have seen, especially in the last